Welcome, everyone, to the Project Censored Radio Show. Thanks for joining us. We are very glad right now to be speaking to Setareh Ghandehari, who is the Advocacy Director at Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power through collective advocacy, grassroots organizing, and strategic communications to abolish immigration detention in the United States. Setareh collaborates with DWN members and coalition partners across the country to advance DWN's mission. Setareh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to dive into the Biden administration's recently released updates to immigration policy, which are kind of not updates, but more of the same. And among these updates, quote unquote, there is an expansion of Title 42. So could you first take us through what Title 42 is and what that expansion entails?
Sure. I'd like to start by saying that Biden's new immigration enforcement policies, which, like you said, is really a continuation of more of the same, continues a failed decades-long deterrence strategy, which doesn't work and is really a page from the same xenophobic, anti-immigrant playbook as the previous administration. And these policies will cause immeasurable harm for people who are seeking safety in the United States. To answer your question, Title 42 is a law that gives the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, authority to refuse entry of certain goods and people at the border when the CDC determines that there's a possibility of communicable disease transmission in the US. Despite the objections of CDC officials at the time, the Trump administration pushed the agency to exercise this authority at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Public health experts then and now widely agree that there is no public health justification for using Title 42 during the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout much of the first couple years of the pandemic, travel to and from the US continued for many people, yet Title 42 was in place and used to restrict entry of people at the border who were seeking humanitarian protection in the US. And now that in our day-to-day lives, there are virtually no pandemic protections that remain, it's more clear than ever before that there was and there is no public health reason to have it in place. Yet the Biden administration has continued to use it primarily for political purposes, as did the previous administration under Trump. So, I should clarify that the Biden administration has tried to lift the ban and they've been dealing with a court battle. But at the same time, the administration was very, very slow to start winding it down. And, from our perspective, they've really put up a lackluster fight. Now, on top of that, they have announced that they plan to actually expand the use of Title 42. So while the courts for now have prevented them from lifting it, nowhere have they been required to expand it. And yet that's what they're doing here under this new policy to allow for rapid expulsions of people from Cuba, from Haiti, and Nicaragua and Venezuela to Mexico. Under Title 42, people that enter between ports of entry can be rapidly expelled, which is really just a euphemism for deported without any, real process as it used to be, without any chance to apply for asylum, which goes against US law and international agreements. Before this announcement, whoever was expelled really depended on who Mexico was willing to accept. It's been people from Mexico, from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. But the recent developments have extended this agreement with Mexico to include people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And so people who generally haven't been accepted by Mexico will end up in Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Customs and Border Protection detention, basically in jail, awaiting flights to be expelled to their home countries. And I think Haiti is a really critical example to talk about because, under Title 42, previously, Haitians would spend time in ICE detention and then, be put on flights to be expelled. And now it's going to be that much easier to expel Haitians to Mexico. From the beginning, this policy was intended to close down our borders to Black and brown migrants who are seeking safety. It was never about public health, and that continues under the Biden administration and under this new policy.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very clear. And I also understand that it's not just Title 42. So it seems like there are several, the Biden administration has several weapons in its at its service for this issue. The Biden administration pointed out that even if Title 42 is removed, Title 8 remains in place to quickly force asylum seekers and migrants out of the U.S. What is Title 8 compared to Title 42?
Sure. So Title 8 is just another way to refer to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the body of laws that generally govern US immigration process. So expedited removal is a process within Title 8, which was added to the immigration laws in 1996. And it gives immigration officers the ability to more rapidly deport people who are apprehended at the border or who have entered the US very recently. Over the years, expedited removal has been applied in, various ways depending on the administration. Legally, even under expedited removal, it shouldn't apply to certain categories of people, including refugees and asylum seekers. But of course, in practice, people who are subject to expedited removal don't know their rights. They often, don't know that they have to express their fear. There's rarely an opportunity to show that they're eligible for asylum with an immigration officer. They don't have an opportunity to appear before a judge. They don't go to court. So the use of expedited removal has really always been a concern, and it's really troubling that the Biden administration is planning to expand its use. The other thing that the Biden administration announced was an intention to issue a new transit ban rule, which further attacks asylum. So essentially, the Biden admin is proposing rules that would ban people from applying for asylum in the US if they don't first apply for protection in the countries that they pass through on their way to the US. And this is something that, again, the Trump administration attempted repeatedly and was repeatedly struck down by the courts. People ended up being denied asylum and other protections, spending prolonged periods of time in ICE detention, which as a system is notorious for abuse and neglect. It has caused family separation and other harms. So taken together, I just want to be really clear. This administration has co-signed a right-wing agenda that promotes fear and demonizes immigrants.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a succinct label to put on it for sure. And to get a little bit more into the details, as I understand it, there's a so-called humanitarian parole program, which really sounds like an oxymoron, in place for people from those 4 countries that you mentioned. And it's more restrictive than your typical asylum seeking, not just in what's demanded for application, but it only lasts for 2 years, which is really odd, at which point the person could be forcefully deported. So could you talk a little bit about this so-called humanitarian parole program?
Yeah, so what the administration is implementing is a program whereby people in these 4 countries, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti, and this was really modeled after a similar recently rolled out program for Venezuelans. They can apply for this temporary humanitarian parole from their home country. To be eligible, people have to have someone in the US that's willing to sponsor them. Like you said, it's a temporary program. They're here for 2 years. There's a cap on the number of people who can be enrolled. But it completely disregards the fact that people who are fleeing for safety don't have the luxury of going through a lengthy application process from home. They may not have someone in the US or the financial means to buy a plane ticket. They have to get themselves here. Once they get here, they can apply for asylum or other protections. Of course, there's no guarantee. And like you said, they could end up being deported. But it's really absurd and not really how it works for most people who are fleeing for safety. We absolutely need pathways for people to be able to come to the US. And this is, an option that may work for some people. But basically what happens is that for folks who are applying, for folks from these countries who don't now use this new process, asylum will be that much harder for them to access because they will be subject to immediate expulsion to Mexico under this new agreement. So it's really putting people from these countries in a bind. If they don't have the means to apply for this new program, but they're fleeing for their safety, many of them are just going to be out of luck, and it's not the way the asylum system is supposed to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there seems to be, I mean, even more out of reach in terms of this system. There seems to be also a tech divide. There's I was reading that potential asylum seekers or migrants apply from their home country. They can use a phone app. Okay. And they also have, as you mentioned, have to have a US sponsor. And I'm just sitting here wondering, like, that sounds like a lot of work for me. And I'm sitting in a place that is not, that is not difficult to live in day to day. And even I think that I gotta get an app, and then I have to figure out how it works. And what if that's not my main language? I mean, can you talk about this tech divide here and whether you see this as yet another hurdle and a way to exclude folks?
It's a huge barrier. And I mean, honestly, it's absurd. Imagine yourself, you're in a situation, you're facing political persecution, you're facing violence in your home country. There are pressures that people are facing that, let's be real, are often the result of, US foreign policy and global capitalism that is causing people to be in these situations where they have to get out. And the idea that you have the time to first of all, to be able to have a phone. Then, like you said, there's the language barrier. Then, like, let me just take my time and fill out this application. Meanwhile, I'm actually literally running for my life. It just, like, I don't know what other words to use other than absurd. And I think, I all I can think is that they don't know what asylum means. Like, I don't think it means what they think it means. And so there's a tech divide, there's a political divide. I think fundamentally what this signals is that this administration, again, is like just continuing this policy that it's been a common thread among administrations from both parties, that we want to deter people from coming to the US. We don't want them to come and if it serves our political interests, right? So all of a sudden, when there's a political reason for us to be welcoming of Ukrainians, for example, as we should, then it's really easy to get everyone here. But if it doesn't serve our political interests, if it doesn't serve our economic interests in a very obvious way, then we're not welcoming. And I think that's really the root of the problem here. It's about where do we stand as a country, and are we welcoming or not? And I think the answer has been pretty clear through at least when it comes to governments. I know that most of us, my neighbors and everyone I talk to, we know we have this, we want to be welcoming, we want to support each other, and it strengthens our communities when we do that. So it's not what's happening at the higher levels.
No, definitely not. And I want to piggyback on what you so rightfully pointed out, that it always bothers me when people discuss migration in the US that they don't talk about US imperialism. And in fact, last June, the UN Refugee Agency reported that for the first time on record, the global number of people forced to flee their homes had crossed the 100 million mark. And of course, some of that is climate chaos, but that could also be related to the US, since the US military is the largest single contributor of greenhouse gases, equal to about 140 nations just by itself. And I find it so telling that the Biden administration targets Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti, 4 nations that have been decimated by US sanctions and meddling for decades. In the case of Haiti, hundreds of years. And now these people can't claim asylum despite the fact that they're fleeing conditions structured, at least in part, by US imperialism. And so I think that is a very important part to note. And then also in terms of how these people are treated if they do make it to a U.S. border. You mentioned several times detention centers, which have rightfully been compared to and called concentration camps. Can you talk about these camps and whether they're even mentioned or included in Biden's latest policy shift?
Biden doesn't really mention them. I mean, as I mentioned before, people who aren't immediately expelled at the border will end up in ICE or CBP detention for some period of time while they're awaiting, the travel arrangements that the government needs to make to expel them. And yes, I mean, the ICE detention system really looking back at the history, really grew when we had a huge number of people from Haiti and Cuba coming to the United States in the early 90s. And that was really sort of the sort of historical moment when the ICE detention system really ballooned. And there's always been a racial undertone to ICE detention. It's grown hand in hand with mass incarceration in the United States. And so I don't think we can sort of separate US imperialism, US policies around white supremacy from ICE detention, from the immigration system. And ICE detention centers themselves are just horrendous places where people really suffer abuse at the hands of, ICE people who work in the ICE detention centers. The food is often spoiled. They don't have adequate access to water, to basic hygiene products. I think many of the folks out there may remember a couple of years ago when there was the case of the forced hysterectomies on women who were detained at the Irwin County Detention Center. So, and that was just one example. It's really just emblematic of the system as a whole. And there's no reason for it to exist. I mean, migration is just a part of human life. People move. People have always moved. And the idea that we can control it somehow by putting people in these horrendous settings is really appalling when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also curious kind of about the other side of this, because you mentioned a few times that people are just kind of dumped into Mexico. And this, of course, as Detention Watch has pointed out, these people are at a heightened risk of kidnapping, trafficking, and murder as they are, either left, dumped into Mexico or waiting in Mexico to cross. This seems to be, I mean, again, like I'm curious if the Biden administration has mentioned this at all, and I'm also curious if you know of how Mexico has responded to this and what their policies are regarding this mess of the U.S. is making.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not, our focus at Detention Watch Network is really with the ICE detention system. I don't have a lot of sort of like stats off the top of my head in terms of how Mexico is responding. We know from our partners that, there have been countless violent acts that have occurred against people who have, been stuck at the border in Mexico. The government has agreed with the United States in some way to accept these expulsions. So there's definitely some negotiation happening, but Mexico is not equipped. Essentially what we're doing is offshoring our detention system into Mexico and detaining people there and putting it on the Mexican government to do that, which is, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the punting that the U.S. is very good at, particularly Democrats. And I kind of want to, I don't want to play devil's advocate. I just want to share what the devil's advocates, or really, honestly, these advocates for Biden's plan are saying. Corporate media, I've just scrolled through some examples, are saying that Biden's doing the best he can, and that this is just a step on the road to more progressive policies, which I feel like the Democrats always say that, like, look, we're going to take 10 steps back, but it's really part of our step forward. Meanwhile, I did some Googling on this, and in his first 2 years, Trump signed 6 executive orders just on immigration alone. All told, he signed more than 200 executive orders. What realistically could Biden do right now to legitimately address this situation?
What could Biden do? He has, immigration is really in the control of the executive branch in many ways. The executive branch decides, how to enforce our immigration laws. Today, President Biden could cancel contracts for immigration detention. That is fully within his power. He does not have to detain people. There are several contracts that are up for renewal this year. All he has to do is not renew them. That's it. He doesn't even have to do anything. So we could immediately get rid of several ICE detention centers this year simply by him not renewing these contracts. So I think that's one really easy thing. I think, while the courts, Biden really dragged his feet on Title 42. Eventually, there was a plan to lift it that has been blocked, but that court decision in no way told him that he had to expand Title 42. That was completely the Biden administration's own doing. So they can walk that back today. So there's really a lot, they make the decisions on how to enforce our immigration laws, whether to expand Title 42, whether to renew ICE detention contracts. While our immigration laws are problematic and need to be fixed, or not fixed, they're operating as intended. They need to be rewritten. There's a lot that Biden could do today if he was really interested in progressive immigration policy.
Yeah, and that is a big if. It would require a quite a significant change of heart. And I kind of wanted to expand the viewfinder there to include Congress, because this is also something that I feel like the Democrats are really good at. Like, look, my hands are tied. I really wish I could help you. I mean, we saw this with abortion too. If we just had more Democrats, we would codify Roe v. Wade into law, which they could have done at any point in the past 50 years. So, I mean, I feel like when they do have control, they do nothing. And when they don't, they complain that they don't have control, and so their hands are tied. Based on your experience specifically with this issue of detention and migration, what do you feel the likelihood is of an overhaul, either through Congress or what you were mentioning with the executive branch, in the near future?
I'm not very optimistic. Like you said, they had a chance just a couple months ago, just a few months, not even, right? Like a month ago. And they didn't do it. And now we have a Republican controlled House who is trying to do the exact, basically like cement the worst of Trump's anti-immigrant policies. We have an administration that hasn't been putting up a real fight and has in fact really doubled down on those policies, using the rhetoric of, we want to do better, but in reality, they have co-signed to those policies. So I am not optimistic that that things are going to change without a fight. What I am optimistic about is that we have a really vibrant immigrant rights community who is continuing to push the administration and Congress. Detention Watch Network is a membership-based organization. We have members across the country who are fighting locally in their communities to shut down ICE detention centers. And we've successfully pushed the administration to close several of them over the last 2 years. So I have hope in our people, and I have hope that, you know, if we continue to push, that eventually we will get to what we want, which is a world where people are able to move freely, and who, you know, people aren't detained simply for migrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you, because I always like to leave these conversations on a note of hope. And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I think that there are so many examples throughout the history of our country, but also just in general, that governments don't do anything unless they're pushed to do them, but they can be pushed to forcefully make change that aligns with not only human rights, but what, as you've pointed out a couple of times, what the people actually want. So thank you for pointing that out. And so I want to also ask how people can connect with your organization and any other ideas you might have for getting involved on this issue of detention and migration.
Absolutely. So our website is detentionwatchnetwork.org. We're all on all the social media platforms at Detention Watch. So definitely check us out there. And, you know, in terms of getting involved, you know, I think there's a system of over 200 ICE detention centers across the country. There's a good chance there's one near where you live. So find the people who are organizing to shut that facility down, get involved locally. If you don't know who to get involved with, reach out to us. But definitely, I think our power comes from this sort of all of us doing our part at the local level and coming together to coordinate action to push the administration to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to also point out that I think sometimes there's a lack of understanding of these systems, and ICE is younger than I am. I mean, just these agencies are quite significantly younger than I am. These agencies are very new. So the idea that we couldn't live without them, or, oh, woe is me, what are we going to do? We've done fine without them before. So there are many alternatives that would highlight human rights, and, as you've pointed out, what people actually want. So Setareh, thank you so much for taking the time, for sitting down with us and going through all this information.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.